morning, Jeffrey, and welcome back to the Low Carb Paleo Show.
I'm so glad to be with you guys again.
Well, it's been a while, so we have a lot to talk about. Good morning, Monsieur Mark.
Good morning. I trust everybody is wonderfully well today.
Indeed.
Excellent.
I'm still alive. I guess that's good.
It's a good start to the day. Waking up alive. Yep.
Yeah, it's a tough job, but someone's got to do it. Jeffrey, as a quick reminder, you are the founding executive director of the Institute for Responsible Technology. And you and Amy Hart recently released a new documentary film called Secret Ingredients. So why don't we talk about the movie? What can you tell us about this new movie or documentary?
Well, we look at individuals who switched to organic food and had amazing recoveries in their health. And it's something that I have been hearing about for years. And in my earlier film, Genetic Roulette, I had to rush it out to get it published in time for the Prop 37 labeling fight in California. So I didn't really get a chance to do the film that I wanted, which was to follow more individuals in terms of their recovery. When I met Amy Hart, who was a filmmaker and excellent filmmaker, we ended up meeting, and I was speaking at a chiropractic conference, and I announced from the podium, if anyone has an interesting story about when they switched to non-GMO organic, we can put it on film. So Kathleen DiChiara came to our hotel room and we interviewed her, and she described how she and her family had 21 chronic conditions between the 5 members of their family. She had to quit her job because she was incapacitated. She couldn't walk. She had chronic pain. Her son was autistic. Other son had rashes all over his body, eczema. Another one had mood issues and digestive problems, et cetera, et cetera. And she started studying nutrition and started experimenting with the family, removing this and that. And then they were reducing their symptoms, but they weren't going away. So even without gluten and processed, commercial dairy and some soy, when they learned about GMOs and the Roundup sprayed on food and they switched to organic, then they had the revelation and the revolution. Things changed. Right. In the film, we hear, and this is a plot spoiler, that the autistic son is no longer on the spectrum. And this is just one of the families we looked at. There's another family whose autistic son became non-autistic and no longer diagnosed after they switched to organic food. Right after we interviewed Kathleen, we interviewed a chiropractor who would see people at her clinic. And for the infertile couple, she put them on a particular protocol, which was, in addition to the chiropractic, to have organic food. Mm-hmm. And these people had been through IVF or infertility clinics, and oftentimes it was a last resort because they heard word of mouth that she's been effective. Well, at the time we interviewed her, I think there was 52 couples who were infertile that went through her program and followed the protocols, and all of them were either pregnant or had children. By the time we did the film, we were shooting, it was like 70 something. And by the time we wrapped the film, it was 92. I spoke to her recently, it was 123 with 0 failures. And this gives you an idea of how food is, because infertility is skyrocketing, but so too is cancer and skin conditions and overweight and all that. And all of these things got better when people switched to an organic diet. And I made sure that we interviewed physicians who prescribe organic diets in their clinics, because they verified that these were not just one-offs that we hunted down and that there was some other reason, that they too were regularly seeing these type of revolutionary recoveries. And we explained scientifically, along with the help of incredible animation, of what was happening in the body so that people understood the Roundup and the GMO connection.
Right, right. Um, I saw the preview, but unfortunately I didn't get the chance to watch the whole thing. So maybe you can send me a link so I can watch the whole thing. I noticed that your movie won multiple awards. Congratulations. What
Thank you.
was the general reception?
Well, the movie turns out to have, I would say, in fact, I have no doubt that it is the most effective conversion tool to increasing organic consumption. Uh, Everyone, we ask people before they watch it to give us a percentage of how much organic food they eat, including when they go out to eat and eat at friend's house. And then I asked the audience to show, either write it down or a show of hands, depending on the category. And then they watched the film. And I said, okay, what's your number going to be? And everyone, even the people that are like 80 to 100%, except those that are 100% organic, virtually everyone has adopted a higher number because they realize, they've just seen these transformations and they realize the incredibly negative impact of GMOs and Roundup, which is sprayed on GMOs and non-GMOs in the food supply, and they want to avoid both. So the reception has been remarkable in its life-changing capacity, which is exactly why Amy and I created the movie. It's doing the job. So people say to me, you know, I want to tell you how important your film is. I've been trying to get my husband to change his food. He watched the film and now he's more vigilant than I am, or my daughter, or my parents, or my uncle, or my friends. This is so common. And so when people say to me, how do I get my relative to change their diet? I said, you can't, because you're discredited because you're the relative. Let me do it. Let Amy and I do it. Show the film, and then you will see that's the best we can do, because there hasn't been anything more convincing, because it's got that emotional stories, which, I mean, I literally cry when I watch it every time. And then there's the science, and then there's the obvious transformation, which is completely logical. And then we point out how, in some cases, I mean, I can spend hours talking about this, how that information was hidden from view intentionally by the companies and by their support wing in Washington.
Yeah. Well, we already addressed that before, but I mean, it doesn't matter who is in charge, as in at the top or in the White House, the same crabs keeps on being sold, and the same issues continue to pop up. Just briefly, can you mention some of the names of the people in the movie, both personal and professionals?
Sure. I mentioned Kathleen DiChiara. Marcia Shaker is the chiropractor. Dr. David Perlmutter, who wrote Brain, Brain, and Brainmaker, he has he speaks a lot about the microbiome. And he points out that glyphosate, which is the chief poison in Roundup, which is sprayed on a lot of our food supply, is actually patented as an antibiotic. And we actually know, even since the film, we know even more about how devastating it is to the microbiome, absolutely changing the whole population, reducing the diversity, killing off the beneficial bacteria, allowing pathogens to grow, reducing the short chain fatty acids, et cetera, et cetera. So we know it sets up the body for disease. He talks about that, and leaky gut. Dr. Michelle Perro, who's a pediatrician, named one of the top pediatricians in America for many years. She co-wrote the book, What's Making Our Children Sick. She happened to sort of stumble across GMOs when she was doing some activism for a local group, supporting their activism to stop the spray. One of the people gave her my book. She started looking at it and went, oh my God, this is what's happening to our children, because she was seeing a whole new set of diseases and complications in the health of the children she was seeing, and realized it was the GMOs and the chemicals sprayed on them. And so she has amazing stories when she takes whole families and puts them on organic, not only does the autistic boy, for example, start to improve, but everyone else in the family starts to improve, and she's not even treating them. They just accommodated the autistic boy's diet. We have some doctors who I interviewed at the Environmental Health Symposium, and they talk about, like Lisa Naj and others, they talk about what happens when someone backtracks, when they or backslides. They're eating, their health gets better, they're eating well, and then they switch. Either for some people it's one meal, for some people it's a weekend or a vacation or just a gradual reduction, and then their symptoms come back, and then they realize more clearly than ever the need to stay on the organic diet. And so they talk about that. Anthony Samsel, who's a scientist who's been doing research on glyphosate, he has a very emotional story about his own wife, but he also was able to procure 20,000 pages of research that was hidden by the EPA that showed glyphosate has a devastating impact on the animals that it was tested on, and it was all hidden away, and excuses were made that were not scientific as to why, by the EPA, why they didn't have to bother considering the outcomes.
Yeah. Makes you wonder why a government agency that is supposed to protect us is hiding stuff from us.
Well, a lot of that came out during the Monsanto trials. I was in touch with the lawyers. I attended some of the sessions. I read the transcripts, and in fact, I was named in one of the trials because they got millions of pages of memos, and there I am in one of Monsanto's memos, how they push their so-called scientist, their front person, to try and attack me because I pointed out that children are more at risk to the potential dangers. And they funded this person to create a website to try and counter my book, Genetic Roulette, and it's his website that tries to counter my book lies about what my book says. So that gives you a sense of the moral and ethical standpoint. So we know from those documents made public from the trial how Monsanto has its people in the EPA. Jess Rowland, their lapdog, was in charge of determining that glyphosate did not cause cancer according to the EPA committee. He was in charge, and what did they do? They looked at Monsanto studies, not at the peer-reviewed published studies that the World Health Organization used to determine that it does, in fact, cause cancer, or it's a probable human carcinogen and a definite animal carcinogen. So we can pick apart and understand why these organizations are captive. The FDA, the person in charge of the GMO policy, was Monsanto's former attorney, who then became Monsanto's vice president, who then became the U.S. food czar. The revolving door, sometimes it's blatant like that. The EPA, there's a person that went back and forth between the EPA and Monsanto over and over again. Their former administrators became members of Monsanto's board. So it's not a regulatory agency designed to protect the public. As one very upset senior toxicologist wrote after she had to retire because of cancer, she wrote a very strong letter to Jess Rowland, urging him to determine that glyphosate was a probable human carcinogen, saying, do right for once in your career and stop doing things just to get a bonus and for the benefit of the companies that are submitting their products. And she even said, and that, this other person who was involved with pesticides, who was working with Jess, she said, if there's anyone in the agency who's taking bribes, it's her, because what she says makes no sense. And, she also accused Jess Rowland of changing results and steering results of committees to benefit the corporations. So it's right there in black and white.
Right. So this Californian trial was actually a good thing for all of us. Yes. Not so good for Monsanto and Bayer, but because now they're being how many suits do they have now? Like 220 or something? Well,
no, the lawsuit number is the number of plaintiffs. 42,700 plaintiffs, but that actually is expected to be up to 100,000 now.
Wow.
I just read that this week, that the actual number is probably 100,000. There's an industry that I'm just learning about because of this trial that they get paid to deliver plaintiffs, right? So there's been over 500,000 commercials driving people to, do you have cancer? And, you know, if so, all over the country, online, all these things. So a lot of people know about the link between cancer and Roundup because they've been asked if they have cancer and Roundup, and they've been using Roundup to, they may be entitled to some money, which is true because they're discussing a settlement now. And the settlement could be, will be in the billions if it's accepted. They're thinking about maybe $8 billion with a $2 billion set aside for future cases. That's the last that was reported. What it actually turns out to be is unknown. But we do know that those commercials have helped popularize the fact that Roundup is related to cancer, which is helping nudge it out of the shelves of some of the hardware stores and garden stores and big box stores.
It's not funny, but it's funny in a way. Bayer's board of directors must be kicking themselves now for buying Monsanto, right?
Oh, the thing is this. I mean, their shareholders erupted. I mean, they had a vote of no confidence, which was unprecedented in Bayer's history, and the CEO still didn't step down. There was a lawsuit against Bayer saying that they by the shareholders. After the first, by the time the third trial was over, Bayer lost. At one point, it was over maybe $50 billion in capitalization. It's not quite that anymore, but they spent $63 billion for Monsanto, and then lost their own value by $50 billion. It was like they dropped close to 50% in their value during the announcements, and Monsanto had set aside $260 million, something like that, for all of the lawsuits, for all of them. And the first judgment by the jury was $289 million. Now the judge reduced it to about $80 million, but that gives you an idea of how confident Monsanto was for all of the lawsuits. And then on the third trial, the jury awarded a couple $2.055 billion. And that was reduced by a judge to about 80 million. And then a third one was reduced to about 25 million. But it's still heavy duty change. I mean, this is a lot. And I remember going out to dinner with with the couple that had just been awarded $2.055 billion. The night that they had been awarded it, there was a big dinner, and all the lawyers were there, and the first plaintiff from the first thing, he was there with his wife, and I was sitting next to this couple, and I turned to them and says, "So how you feeling?" And they're like, "It's surreal." The wife said, "I don't even know what $2 billion is." And we all knew that it was going to be reduced by the judge. But, and of course, they're challenging it from the appeals court. The EPA, in their glorified lapdog nature, they wrote a Friends of the Court brief to try and tell the appeals court to eliminate all charges and to reverse the lower court, because it's their decision to determine whether glyphosate causes cancer, not a court. Well,
yeah,
balance of power here, guys.
Like we would trust them. Most of us know by now that pretty much all federal agencies are corrupted by the corporations industry. What I wonder about this, and it's a little bit off the subject, I understand, but didn't Bayer do their research before they bought Monsanto? What was the deal there?
Well, I published.
They had to know. They had to know.
I published a article listing, I think, 8 reasons why it was a terrible idea. They were unreported liabilities, and the cancer was just one of them. We now have information showing that livestock, when they're put on non-GMO feed, they get healthier and the farmers make more money. So there's a lot of money potentially there in lawsuits. We know that the pollution of GMOs lasts forever because it damages the gene pool and it's self-propagating. And we know that the environmental impact of both GMOs and Roundup is potentially catastrophic. So I listed all these things. It was published on a financial website. I was interviewed by German television. I explained the problems there. The German TV producer explained to me that Bayer wanted to buy Monsanto because their pharmaceutical pipeline was drying up and they needed to diversify, and they had a crop division and wanted some of the intellectual property of Monsanto. Monsanto was desperate for diversifying because their Roundup was becoming less effective in the field because the weeds were outsmarting Monsanto and becoming Roundup resistant. And so they desperately needed to diversify. But it was interesting that their entire fortune was leveraged on Roundup because their vast amount of money that they created was based on Roundup ready crops and Roundup herbicide. And if Roundup had just been declared a carcinogen by the World Health Organization, and it was becoming less effective, and countries and cities were starting to eliminate it, to ban it because of the determination of carcinogenicity, who in their right mind would pick them up? Now they have a lot of machines that can produce new genes and automatic, driven by artificial intelligence, and vast amounts of robots and vast amounts of, they bought a weather company, a bee research company, but their main cash cow was dying, the Roundup, and they were purchased. So I've offered, all the evidence that was public and available at the time when they purchased it. I had put it together in a 17-page report at the time, and I've made that available so that people could realize that the Bayer purchase was based on ignoring evidence.
And also not to, to make Bayer innocent, because they also have their a slew of toxic products they're spraying on crops as well.
I mean, if you'd want to talk about innocence and Bayer, it's like innocence and Bayer. I mean, they were created when IG Farben broke up. IG Farben was the chemical conglomerate that was embedded in Nazi Germany. They created the chemical that was used to kill people in the concentration camps. They had 100,000, I'm told, slaves from the concentration camps. And it was interesting that some people in Nuremberg wanted to go after the IG Farben as much as the members of the Nazi party. They broke them up and Bayer was born. So we have an interesting, Bayer and Monsanto bedfellows. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Okay, I guess we already spent too much time on that, but I've noticed recently you've shifted your attention from GMO to more like into Roundup and Glyphosate. Why?
Well, actually, there's a shift since then. It's not more Roundup, it's that Roundup has more evidence of harm than the GMOs, because there's a lot more research on the chemical than there is on the plants. There's, Dr. Seralini's research looked at Roundup ready corn that had been sprayed with Roundup, the corn that had never been sprayed with Roundup, and the Roundup without the corn, and all three groups of rats had multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. So there's substantial harm that comes from the corn by itself, the Roundup by itself, and their combination. But still, we know that Roundup, it is an antibiotic and damages the beneficial bacteria in the gut. It is a chelator, so it blocks the absorption of minerals, which can shut down certain pathways. It blocks the shikimate pathway used by gut bacteria to produce the precursors to serotonin, very important, melatonin, dopamine, and without those neurotransmitters in abundant supply, all sorts of mental issues and pain and Parkinson's and other things can occur. It can throw off the hormones. It can create leaky gut. It can damage the DNA, which can lead to cancer. It cuts off the communication to some extent between the cells, called gap junctions, as well as the tight junctions, causing separation. It damages the actin, which is the structural basis of cells and nerves, and that also damages the mitochondria, destroying the integrity of the mitochondria in cells, which is the basis of the energy of the whole system. And there's mitochondrial theories of cancer and aging. It also can suppress digestive enzymes, and I'm just getting started. And then there's the next generation, and not only causes birth defects, but I interviewed in a live Facebook Dr. Skinner, who injected Roundup into a pregnant mouse, and the great-grandchildren suffered the most. 90% of the great-grandchildren had serious issues in prostate, kidneys, obesity, and death during birth. And he found the changes in the sperm cells. So he could see the epigenetic effects inherited. Right. And we're talking about, and so one of the reasons why I'm talking about Roundup is because it's easier to talk about how it dismantles the very foundations of our health. Two, our institute has been very successful at inspiring 46% of surveyed Americans to say they're seeking non-GMO food. Now we have to take those 46% and have them seek organic, because Roundup is sprayed as a desiccant to dry down the grains and the beans in our food supply, as well as it's sprayed on a lot of fruit and vegetable fields to kill the weeds, and it gets into the fruits and vegetables, it gets deeply into the grains and beans. And so we need to finish the arc where we've convinced people to avoid GMOs. Now we need to convince them to eat organic. And that's where the film, Secret Ingredients, is the best vehicle for the short-term conversion that we have found.
Right. Well, thank you for all of that, because I was going to ask all these questions. Also, I suppose the farmers are pretty pissed off too. They're probably suing Monsanto as well, because they lost some income, and countries like China are refusing to use GMO crops and so on and so forth. So what's going on that side?
China's a bit schizophrenic on this. They do import GMOs. They say they don't grow them, but there's evidence that they have, and they may still be. There may be some GM crops there that no one knows about, that are being introduced and imported and eaten in the United States, because there's no requirement in the United States to evaluate imported GMOs, just as there's no FDA requirement for them to evaluate GMOs created here. But when China does not approve a particular variety, then that variety, if it's introduced in the United States, it can cause whole shipments to be turned around. And that happened with the Syngenta product, and there was a lawsuit of $2 billion by ADM and Cargill and all these different farmers. Sometimes the farmers have run across problems when they tried to sue Monsanto. A friend of mine tried to get a class action. The class action motion was denied by the judge, and it was reported later by the New York Times that the judge had been an attorney of record for Monsanto, and never acknowledged it during the trial, never recused himself, and sure enough, went towards, paved the way for that to be dismissed. Clarence Thomas wrote the majority opinion for a piece that was paving the way. It was a Supreme Court judge. Yeah. He was a Monsanto attorney earlier, and he didn't recuse himself, and that particular Supreme Court decision had a lot of favor towards Monsanto. So I was very happy to see that these particular trials that are going on are doing well, and that there's a lot of different judges involved, and Monsanto can't own them all.
Yeah. Something just popped up when you talked about China. Now, I understand that some American companies are buying, quote unquote, organic products from China, but the standards are not as stringent as they are here. And so some of the, quote unquote, organic food from China may not be organic at all.
There's always that concern. And I was in China a few times, and I asked about that. And I heard something which was very unsatisfying for consumers, and that is, if the organic inspector is from a government agency, they're very strict because they're concerned about the reputation. And if it's not, then we don't know. Now, we don't know who the inspector is anyway, so we end up, so it's unknown. It's unknown. I don't know how much fraud there is. And the thing is, you want to try to avoid the GMO contamination, and there's not a lot of GMOs growing in China, so the GMO contamination might be low or depending on the product, but there's also the possibility of being sprayed. And, you know, even in this country, there's certainly the possibility of contamination by GMOs and spray drift. And occasionally, there's either fraud or misidentification of whole shipments. There was a guy in Illinois that had been for 10 years defrauding the organic industry, selling things as organic. There was a test done on 23 products in California, and 2 shipments of soy for animal feed were labeled organic, but they were actually GMO. So there is some concern, and we don't know the percentage. There is something called the glyphosate residue-free certification, which requires testing on things, even if they're not organic. And the non-GMO project requires testing for GMO contamination for systems that use at-risk ingredients like soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, potatoes, apples, zucchini, yellow squash, and papaya. So those are the GMOs. So there's ways that you can help support, you know, get your more confidence over your product.
Right. I read recently that glyphosate residues has been found in juices, wine, beer.
Yep.
So I mean, can we escape all of that? I mean, it's surrounding us. It's everywhere.
100% no. You can't be 100% glyphosate free with any level of confidence, because it's in the air, especially in the Midwest. It's in the rain. Right. It's in some people's drinking water.
Yeah.
And in Montana, they use glyphosate to sterilize, essentially, the chemical fallow, it's called. They spray it all over the empty field to kill all the weeds. And that's a tremendous amount of glyphosate sprayed. It then gets into the air, and then it rains on the organic crops.
And then it gets into the water tables.
Water tables, it gets into the rain. Someone I know I was interviewing, we have a 90-day lifestyle upgrade program for people who watch the film and want to get help. They want to get help of turning organic, so we give them all these tips and sort of accelerate their organic evolution by many years in just 90 days. And I interviewed some companies that have done research and created products that were outstanding. And there's a company that this woman wanted to get a non-glyphosate wine and work with that particular vineyard. And everywhere she checked, even organics, they were all had some tiny level of glyphosate. She found one place that had 0 glyphosate. That's the wine that she created and marketed and whatnot. So orange juice, the orchards are sprayed. The vineyards are sprayed. The rows, the non-organic ones, they spray the rows. So you can see them. There's no vegetation on there. So we're hoping that all of our work will eliminate it from use in agriculture. And we're not there yet, but the trend is happening. And for people who want to eliminate it from their schools, their parks, their cities, city parks and county parks, they can go to rounduprisks.com, and we interview 4 women who've been very successful at doing just that. And we have resources that you can use. It's literally been where a single phone call followed up by 1 or 2 emails can stop the spraying of Roundup in a jurisdiction. It's It's that simple. And because you have so many places that spray, you have your homeowners association, you have your dog park. Don't talk to, I mean, we have petsandgmos.com. If you have dogs or cats, go there, change the foods of your pets. So there's so many different places that use it. And you know that there are people that as soon as they hear that it's actually declared a probable human carcinogen and that there are non-toxic, cost-effective alternatives that will ultimately cost them less money, have better results that have been done by places like Irvine, California, and there's evidence for that, and there's lawsuits linking it to cancer, and you're using it still, all of a sudden you go, okay, what can I do? And then they'll get training, et cetera, in terms of using other methods.
Right. So I should suspect my cat food.
If you go to petsandgmos.com, you'll see we have tested a bunch of pet food, cat food and dog food for glyphosate levels.
So what was that? Pets?
Petsandgmos.com. Your cat really wants you to write this down, Alan.
GMO.
Petsandgmos.com. Your cat is very happy now.
All right, she's happy. See, I'm writing it down.
Yeah.
And the thing is, if you go there, there's a 10-minute and a 2-minute video. And the 2 minutes is just a condensation where we interview a lot of veterinarians who've put their patients on organic food and food that's not organic but has no GMOs or no Roundup. And the changes are remarkable. I was interviewing Barbara Royal, and she's an author and she's Oprah Winfrey's veterinarian, and she now is so convinced that the food is the issue. The main, when someone comes to her, she puts the animals on a new diet and sends them away, unless of course it needs to patch up, there's a physical injury. They come back a few weeks later and 80 to 90% are managed. 80 to 90%. 40% have zero symptoms, right? The others are like managed and they're getting better. And she saw that when GMOs were introduced into the food supply, then cancer rates shot up in cats and dogs. Dogs have 1 out of 1.6 dogs have cancer or cancer. And the allergies and the digestive issues. And this, I've seen this over and over again in pets, in livestock, and in humans.
Yeah, I've been wondering for years, why do animals get human sickness? Kidney failures and cancers and food allergies and so on. It's like when I grew up, we had dogs eating or drinking food out of the puddles on the street, and they never get sick, and they eat whatever garbage was around. And now we have dog or pets that are treated like humans, and yet they get all these sickness, which doesn't make any sense.
And dog urine contains 40 times the amount of glyphosate as human urine on average.
Wow.
Because they have so much glyphosate in their pet food, and they eat the same thing over and over again, they end up with high concentrations in their body. And we know, according to the World Health Organization, that glyphosate causes cancer in animals. And the pet veterinarians I've interviewed said it used to be there was hardly ever, once a month, a cancer in dogs. Now it's several times a day.
Wow. Yeah.
But Jeffrey, you've given us a huge amount of information already. Is there a central site where people can get links out to the ones you've mentioned?
Yes. And we haven't even talked about my new area.
No.
Yes, so I'm going to give you some sites here. Responsibletechnology.org. That's the mothership. I would recommend that people do 2 things: subscribe and donate. I'll explain why donations are so critical right now in just a moment. All right, I'll do that now. If you go to protectnaturenow.com, there's a 3-minute video that I highly recommend, which is on our new area of focus. And that is based on the new technology. See, right now, there's a new GMOs in town, and they're from gene editing. And the same rhetoric from 24 years ago when they introduced GMOs into the food supply saying it's safe and predictable. And yet it's now about every 2 weeks that I read a peer-reviewed published study showing how CRISPR, which is the big poster child of the gene editing because it's so cheap and easy, that CRISPR causes unpredicted changes. You know, I just read one this week and did a report on it. I have a podcast at Live Healthy, Be Well, and I post news in addition to the weekly podcast. I post audio commentaries on the news. So at livehealthybewell.com, that's another website. And I reported on this study that showed that when they use gene editing to knock out a gene, to silence a gene, and there's hundreds of thousands of uses where they've used it to knock out genes, finally someone went back and looked and said, oh, guess what? It doesn't always work. 1/3 of the time it fails. And not only you end up with the genes creating proteins, sometimes it's not the original protein, sometimes it's a truncated protein. And anyone that understands protein science realizes, oh my God, you sell something thinking that this gene is knocked out, it's producing a protein that's never been in the human food supply. It might create disease and death. And there's a non-browning mushroom that's available to introduce into the human food supply from gene editing. It's supposed to have a knockout. Is it producing something that could be allergenic or toxic or carcinogenic or an anti-nutrient? We don't know. No one is really doing the studies to see if this side effect prone technology is actually causing side effects in their particular study. Now, getting back to where we're going. It is so cheap and easy. You can buy a CRISPR do-it-yourself kit for $161 on Amazon. It was $159 before Christmas. You missed your chance. And you can create your own lab as a biohacker for $2,000. And if you're Bayer and Monsanto, you have buildings full of robotics driven by artificial intelligence for massive output. Now, imagine if we have massive output in genetically engineered bacteria, right? We know that there's a bacterium that was genetically engineered in the late 80s that if it were released, it might have changed the weather patterns on the planet, because a lot of the weather is determined by Pseudomonas syringae, which is a bacteria which causes condensation of water, and it creates snow and frost. And they engineered it so it didn't work. And if that became dominant in the biosphere, then our weather would change. There was one in the 90s that was almost released. 2 weeks before it was released, they were going to put it out there to see how far it spread. Well, we now know from an EPA private secret research study that they'll deny, but we know from the back end, someone that was doing the research, they actually released bacteria once, and it spread everywhere in the planet in several years. So they were going to release this one bacteria that turned cellulose, plant matter, into alcohol, because they wanted to deliver it to farmers so they could take their crop stubble, instead of burn it, mix it in big barrels with this genetically engineered bacteria, and then create alcohol to run their tractors and to spread the sludge remaining in there on their fields as fertilizer, because it was nutrient rich. So a graduate student, it was already approved by the EPA, had passed all the tests they looked at, but a graduate student needed to do some GMO research in order to get his PhD. So he took that sludge with their permission and spread it on some dirt and planted some wheat seeds. 2 weeks before they were going to release this stuff, he comes into the lab on a Saturday morning. All of the wheat seedlings were turned to mush. It was slime. The bacteria was still active, and it turned the roots and the crops into alcohol.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it was from a type of bacterium, Klebsiella planticola, which is everywhere. It's on all the roots and all the plants, everywhere you find it. It's on trees, it's on soybeans. And it's possible that if this were released, it would become dominant and overcome the population by turning things into alcohol, which would kill the normal Klebsiella planticola, and the genetically engineered one would survive. And imagine if that got spread everywhere on Earth, or let's just say North America. According to Dr. Elaine Ingham, who's was the advisor to the graduate student that did the research, it may have ended terrestrial plants.
Yeah.
So now consider that there may be 100,000 different versions of bacteria released in the next 20 years. Algae, fungus, grasses, insects, birds. Let's say there's 1 million new GMOs introduced in the next 20 years. What do we know about GMOs? Two things that are sobering. One, the number one most common result from genetic engineering is surprise side effects. Two, once you release it, it becomes part of the gene pool irreversibly, permanently, forever. So now we think about 20 years down the road, what are we handing off to the next generation? Not what we inherited, the products of the billions of years of evolution. Instead, we're handing to them a nature replaced by the products of laboratory creations, where the chances of a catastrophe, or worse yet, a cataclysm, are approaching a certainty. Because if you have a probability that's small for a cataclysm, but you multiply the number of organisms and interactions by 1,000 and 1,000,000, then the probability approaches a certainty. And so we're talking about an existential threat here, where just 2 of the bacteria that we know are released almost had that level of catastrophe. And now we have gene editing, where in mice they found, oh, it's pulling DNA from the serum that's used just to hold the cells, and that serum comes from goats and cows. And guess what? It's taking goat and cow DNA and putting it in there. It's like when the scissors cuts the DNA in gene editing, the cellular mechanism outside the scientist's control will sometimes grab DNA as kind of patching material as it puts it together, and it's put into there. What does it put into there? Retroviruses. It's put in there antibiotic-resistant bacterial genes. Those two could create diseases. So now we're talking about the possibility of diseases that can affect humans or animals, the possibility of massive ecological destruction. We know the effect of a single invasive species can cause chaos in an ecosystem. What if you take the ecosystem and replace it? We're talking about potential cataclysm.
Yeah. Can we go back to basics first to explain our listener what is CRISP and how does it work? What's the basic explanation?
All right, and I should say, by the way, we're taking a leadership role to sound the alarm. If you watch the 3-minute film at Tech Nature Now, you'll realize this is an existential threat. 7 out of 7 audiences that I polled rated GMOs as more dangerous than global warming. And this is something that hardly anyone knows about. So this is when I said make a donation at responsibletechnology.org. This is where we're going to be spending your investment. So here's how gene editing works. For CRISPR, you have these molecular scissors, and they're designed to cut the double-stranded DNA. And then you have a guide, which essentially looks for a particular code in the DNA, a certain sequence of the base pairs. And when it hits that code, it says, cut here. Now, the code is just with 4 different elements. And so that particular place where it's supposed to cut is their target. But there's non-target areas that they don't want to cut, but they're either exactly the same code or similar enough that you can get cuts. So they use a computer program that predicts where the other cuts might be. And then they evaluate those other cuts as important or unimportant. Here's where human arrogance plays an important role in CRISPR, where they said, oh, it's not important if it cuts over here. So we expect a bunch of cuts over here that we can live with. So we'll go forward. We won't even evaluate which cuts are actually made. We'll just rely on the computer program to predict and give us a green light, and then we'll make the cut and possibly release the organism. Now, when the very few research studies actually do the gene sequencing, they go, oh, guess what, guys? The computer program was completely wrong. There's bigger insertions and deletions. There's hundreds or thousands of mutations up and down the DNA, most of which would be unpredicted, not predicted by the computer. Mm-hmm. So these like shake awake moments are coming in the peer-reviewed literature, but they're hitting up against a multi-billion-dollar industry whose future depends on people not knowing the truth. Yeah. So they've done this before. They have an echo chamber of misinformation saying this doesn't work. Now, there's another technology which they're also trying to skew and trying to pretend that it doesn't have damaging effects, called RNA interference. And we know that a lot of the unimportant areas of the genome produce RNA, which are regulatory RNA, which help guide and regulate which genes do produce proteins. So RNA is very important. RNA is one of the things that is like it tells the DNA, you work here, you stop there, and then just do this much and whatnot. It's part of the regulatory mechanism. It's part of the work of the orchestra conductor. So they take a little piece of RNA, which is known to impact certain genes, shutting them off. And double-stranded RNA, for example, maybe 21 nucleotides long, folds back like a hairpin. And it also will look for certain sequences. And when it finds those sequences, it will silence that gene. Well, it turns out those sequences are all over the genome, and the double-stranded RNA that's affecting the potato or the apple that is genetically engineered not to turn brown because of this double-stranded RNA, that double-stranded RNA, we eat it. And it turns out it can survive digestion. It can get into the bloodstream. So what happens if it finds the same sequence in our DNA? What if it silences genes inside our cells permanently? And this was of concern by a person I interviewed who used to be with the USDA, who wrote an article saying we don't have the capacity to do a proper safety assessment because of the non-target animal or non-target organism effects, including humans. And there's sprays that use RNA interference where you can spray it on a crop to kill insects because it silences the gene in the insects that ends up on the crop. So what would it do if it gets on our skin? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that Monsanto, now Bayer, has this bizarre theory where it says, oh, it could never influence humans. It doesn't survive digestion or get into the blood supply, except when we want to use it to kill insects. Yeah. It's like over here they said it works, and over here they say it doesn't. So their concept that it's safe is based on pseudoscience, tobacco science, and there was EPA scientists who published something saying it's not safe, and they were ignored. So that's another GMO 2.0, and we know that when you change gene expression, we talked about this earlier, injecting Roundup into mice and having the great-grandchildren suffer the most, more than the grandchildren, more than the children. The great-grandchildren suffered the most. When you change genetic expression with RNA, it's inheritable. Not always, but it can be inheritable. So now we're having sprays and crops. Don't eat the genetically modified innate potato from Simplot. Don't eat the apple from the Arctic apple. If you go on Amazon and you order pre-sliced apples, it could be the Arctic apple. Don't eat it, in my opinion. Because the scientists that I interview say it could reprogram your genes. These are examples of what we're facing from a technological standpoint, and we need to step up. And for 24 years, my focus has been on consumer choice. We've been very successful. Now we have to introduce policy change, because consumer choice is not going to stop the use of RNA interference spraying. It's not going to change it's not going to stop the bacterial releases, the algae releases, the insect releases. We need policy. We need it in curriculum. We need institutional review boards to say no release. We need governments to say no release. We need international treaties to say no release. We need to educate people about the fact that we have arrived at an inevitable time in human civilization where we can easily redirect the streams of evolution, and we don't have the corresponding wide vision of what actually happens in the DNA, the long-term caution, the ethics and moral responsibility. We don't have that. So we need to balance this new capacity with very careful laws and liability laws and restrictions, so we don't end up passing on to future generations a cataclysm.
Right, right. So that leads me to two comments. One of them, we're basically guinea pigs because they're not doing their own research because it's too cost prohibitive to actually do proper research. So they experiment on us until oops, it's too late, and then we have to sue them. Secondly, to change the laws and everything, well, good luck with that, considering that most politicians are bought and paid for by corporations.
So as far as the guinea pig thing goes, it's interesting. We're not even at that level. We're less than that, because if they're doing experiments on us, then they have an experimental group, they have a control, they get data, and they evaluate. What they're doing is they're denying data. There's no post-marketing surveillance. They're ignoring the evidence of change of health. I mean, we see more than 30 diseases rising in parallel with the increased use of GMOs and Roundup in the US food supply. We have 28 different conditions that were reported as being improved in 3,256 people who switched to a non-GMO and largely organic diet. We see the modes of action that relate GMOs and the Bt toxin insecticide and the Roundup that could predict these same diseases and disorders. We have the animal feeding studies where the animals suffer from these type of diseases or their precursors, where you could predict that these outcomes would occur if they were on lifetime diet that was GMO or Roundup enriched. And we have all that evidence, and they're denying and distorting and pretending it doesn't happen. So we're not even guinea pigs. We are collateral damage. Right. Now, as far as changing the politics, we have capacities. Like there was a Terminator technology which Monsanto, Bayer now own, which can create sterile seeds. And they wanted to implement it throughout the food supply so that all seeds would be Terminator genetically engineered, so that it would force the more than 1 billion farmers, 1.4 billion farmers who save their seeds, it would force them to buy seeds from catalogs, which means it would destroy the biological diversity, which is the food security of our planet, in order to sell more seeds in the catalog. This is the mindset of these companies. But these international treaties said no. So there's a possibility for international treaties to prevent the international trade of some of these GMOs. There's countries that are more evolved and advanced than others, like Australia's completely drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak. They said, okay, gene edited anything, you can just create it and introduce it, animals, plants, or microorganisms, we don't care. The US government is trying to do the similar thing and to force other governments to do the same. The EU treats gene editing like other GMOs and does require a certain amount of testing. It's not adequate, but it's much better than the Australian or US attitude. Japan is more in the Australia camp. So there's this big war going on right now to see who's going to be adopting which policies. And there's a lot of pressure on Europe to relinquish its policies based on lies, based on saying, oh, it's safe and predictable, it's just like breeding. No, it's not. So if we can create, and it's not just fighting in the lobbying, it's not just lobbying in the halls of Congress and in the European Parliament, it's educating all the different organizations, the climate change organizations, the ocean saving organizations, the animal rights groups, the gardeners, the birders, the conservation groups, all of them mothers, all of them need to know this is an existential threat where if you are totally successful in your arena, you still may lose nature. If you are so totally successful at stopping climate change, protecting the oceans, protecting our soils, we still may lose nature. This is the first sentence of the 3-minute video at Protect Nature Now. And so it is absolutely essential that all these groups take this up as a talking point. Then we end up with a global movement. It's like add information and stir, global movement. We can't afford to grow a movement from scratch. It has to be these organizations that are focused on planetary survival and environment to realize, oh, no one else is minding the store on this thing. We could lose nature in this generation. We don't have time to wait. We'll add it as a talking point. Now, you'll have tens of millions of people, and then we're going to have some scientific organizations and medical organizations saying no outdoor release. Then we're going to have university students saying to their academic policymakers, no outdoor release, keep GMOs in the laboratory. Then institutional review boards will eliminate the ability for the people working in their universities to have outdoor release. Then we're going to have movements that are going to say no outdoor release, and this has to be built so the politicians will not be leading, they will be following.
Yeah.
And this is how movements are effective. Not asking the politicians to lead, but leading so the politicians follow.
That's right. That's right. This is probably going to be my last question, besides the obvious one, which we will ask again. In France, there's a movement now, and there's a strong debate and a division between the people living near farms and the farmers, because they want the city councils to set up a buffer zone. So when the farmers are spreading, Roundup or Glyphosate, then it doesn't affect people living nearby. The way I saw a documentary a couple of weeks ago about it, and of course, the problem is, if you look at both sides of the story. One side is that people don't want to get cancer and don't want their children to die and so on and so forth. The other one, the farmers are complaining that, if we pass this law, then they'll go out of business because it reduces their, because in France, the amount of land available is much more restricted than it is in America, with a huge piece of land where a buffer zone of, let's say, 200 feet, whatever it is here in this country. So there's a division in France right now between the people and the farmers, and both sides are fighting for their survival. So what do you say to that?
Well, first of all, let's talk about both arguments. From the people's side, there's a lot of evidence that spraying in the vicinity is devastating. It's worse when they spray by plane, like in Argentina, so that the spray gets all over. There's a 300% increase in one region in cancers and a 400% increase in birth defects. And in one concentrated area, in one town, in one location, the birth defect rate went up over 70-fold, over 70-fold. Yeah. I've seen pictures of the kids who have birth defects. I've seen the statistics. There's even examples in a town where the town is next to a soybean field, and they have a map with different colors of different conditions of the people, and the people living right near the soybean field, there's a much higher percentage of cancer and respiratory issues and birth defects than there is on the other side of the town. Yeah. It's very visually compelling, which gives, it's the kind of epidemiological work that you do to see if there's a relationship between proximity and incidence. And so I think the people have a very important argument in terms of spray exposure. Of course, it's in the food supply. And in Europe, even the city dwellers that are far away from farms have glyphosate in their urine, most of them, which means it's in the food. It's also, in Europe, people think it's GMO free, but the animal feed is largely genetically engineered and also sprayed with Roundup. So it gets in that way. Now, from the argument of the farmers, there has been a kind of a orientation, some would call it a brainwashing, but it's that this is the way farming occurs. You know, before, in World War II, when it ended, you had extra bomb-making material, which they turned into fertilizer, and they had extra nerve gas, which they turned into insecticides, and the agrochemical industry was born. Before that, it was farming without chemicals, but it had a lot of knowledge. There was knowledge about how to rotate crops, how to use cover crops. There's a lot of knowledge that got lost or narrowed. It's only available for now in a small percentage of people, so that farmers think that this is the only way to survive and the only way to plant. Whereas when you look at some of the advanced farmers' experience, they have regenerative agriculture, which is building up the soil, which sequesters carbon. They have diversity in their land. The diversity helps bring the pest level down. There's also a thing where with healthy plants, the insects don't eat them because the proteins are in a different structure so that they can't absorb them. So having healthy plants reduces, in many cases, the insect burden. The herbs, you know, there's so much knowledge. I mean, I've been to these advanced farms on every continent for the last 20 years as I've traveled. They always bring me to farms thinking that I want to know, and I do. Although I'm not a farmer, I learn that they actually have it down. And so if you think about who is in charge of the farm information, you have farm radio, farm magazines, agricultural extension agents in the US land-grant universities, and the farm ministry or department. All of them get the marching orders from companies like Monsanto Bayer. All of them. Yeah. The land-grant universities get investment, get donations from them, and then the companies have decisions that they can do over what research is done. The agricultural extension agents become basically agents of the chemical industry, telling them where to spray and when to spray. I've been told by someone that writes for an agricultural magazine, when I gave a talk, she came up to me and said, I write for an agricultural journal, and I'd like to interview you to place the interview somewhere else. I said, why can't you place it in the farm journal? And she said, they would never let me print it there because our advertising dollars come from the biotech industry. So the farm journals and the farm radio are all part of this brainwashing. And so given what the farmers have been taught in these last 2-3 generations, maybe 2 generations, it makes sense for them to feel like they cannot farm because they identify farming as use of chemicals in this way. Right. But if we could get the government and others to educate the farmers about the fact they can make more money per acre, have healthier crops, and live longer and protect the environment and sequester carbon by shifting over, then the argument is won in the favor of protecting the health of the people.
Mm-hmm. We've been interviewing some of these regenerative farmers.
Good.
At least 2 or 3 of them.
Yeah, it's one of the contact points for that, if anyone's interested, is the Savory Institute.
Yes.
Yeah. Another point, as you were talking, in the old days, they also knew how to combine one other thing that spraying glyphosate does, it also kills birds, which are natural predator to insects.
Well, I don't know if it kills birds directly. I don't know if that's the case. It certainly destroys the biodiversity. I mean, when you have less birds for sure in the area. So, yeah. And there is the agrochemicals do kill the birds. There's 2.9 billion birds missing. At the last count, it's like, where'd all the birds go? Tremendous number of birds that are no longer species extinct, and bird counts are way, way down. And that's, I would say, rather than just blaming Roundup, which is participating in this, let's talk about just chemical agriculture and monocropping and, you know, killing all of the plant biodiversity when you spray a Roundup Ready field. So it looks like a factory, no insects, no birds. It's just like vast non-nature for miles in Argentina and parts of the United States. So yeah, there's a complete, and the insect is like a major cataclysm for insects, where the number of insects is dropping catastrophically. So, and all of them are involved in an ecosystem which supports all of us. It's not like, oh, there's nature and we're over here. So we need to completely redesign agriculture in order for protecting our home. And otherwise we are facing something of another type of cataclysm. And we can't, you know, the biotech industry says, well, let's just use GMOs and then that'll solve all the problems. No, that's not the way we do it.
Right, right. Another insect that is very beneficial is being killed is the bees.
Oh yeah. Then they are being killed off by glyphosate, we believe. And there's evidence that shows that when just the level of glyphosate that's natural, not natural, but it's normally in the agricultural fields has reduced the population of bees in the hives. They lose their ability to navigate back to the field. They bring glyphosate back in. It also can explain some aspects of colony collapse disorder, where the animals can starve to death, even though there's plenty of bee bread, but they need lactobacillus in their gut in order to digest, and glyphosate kills off the lactobacillus. So there's a whole scientific explanation, and there was a group that was studying the relationship called Biologics, and they were studying the relationship between Roundup and colony collapse disorder until Monsanto bought them. So that gives you an idea of why Monsanto bought them. So I would say colony collapse disorder has part of its roots in glyphosate and part of its roots in the neonicotinoid insecticide treatments that are known to also damage bee survival.
Right, and bees are pollinators, and they will, you know, they're needed to pollinate multiple food crops for us.
Yes.
Okay, Mark, your turn. I'm exhausted.
I'm just getting started, Alan.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Jeffrey, I mean, as I said earlier, you've given us a lot of information. And I know there's going to be a lot of people going, oh, that can't be true. That can't be true. The government wouldn't let, you know, that happen, blah, blah, blah. We know what governments are like. Obviously, proof is something that is going to perhaps change those people's minds. And I'm sure you've got a great repository to prove everything you've been talking about. Where can we find that?
It depends what I've said. I mean, if you go to protectnaturenow.com, at the bottom of the page, there's a link to other resources.
Right.
And in there, I have interviews with scientists, and we have references, citations.
Excellent.
We also, at responsibletechnology.org, which we're upgrading our website so it'll be easier to navigate, but it's pretty good now. We have several hundred research studies that you can find on Roundup. We have a survey in an article that I wrote that was peer-reviewed for the International Journal of Human Nutrition and Functional Medicine. It's a 26-page article. There's over 200 references and citations. I talk about some of the health dangers, the survey results of the 28 different conditions. We focus specifically on the digestive disorders as a close-up, because that was 85% of the participants said they improved in their digestion significantly, or it was a massive improvement in digestion. I think that the digestive disorders worldwide are being affected by GMOs wherever they're popular in the food supply. And so I also have, there's a book called GMO Myths and Truths, which is online at earthopensource.org. And they have a lot of current references. I have an older book called Genetic Roulette with 1,183 references. So a lot of the information is available at responsibletechnology.org. We link to all these things. And I think for those that have a more scientific angle, they want to get a good dose of the health dangers, that article in the National Journal of Human Nutrition and Functional Medicine, which is available on our site as well, is a good thing. And there's a summary of it in just 4 or 5 pages for those that don't want to speak the jargon.
Excellent, excellent. Now, earlier on in the program, you mentioned the Institute, and it's, I know that's something quite close to your heart. You want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. The Institute for Responsible Technology is a nonprofit that I founded in 2003. And we have been distributing educational information and organizing for years. When we were organizing grassroots groups, before the labeling laws, et cetera, we had 10,000 people in over 100 different organizations, 100 different groups. We put out pamphlets. We gave free essays and articles and reports for others to publish all around the world. We have training. We've trained over 1,500 people to speak about GMOs. We've been involved in putting scientists and farmers together for research and trying to get certain science research funded. We have a website and Responsible Technology, but we have a very active Facebook group where I do live Facebooks usually every week, and in Instagram more and more now. In our live Facebooks, I interview scientists and practitioners, and I also comment on the news. We have a newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks, and I encourage people to sign up for it. And now the new version of the newsletter is I'll do an audio commentary that's also transcribed on the different news, because people hear about something independently and they don't have the bigger picture, and the person writing it usually doesn't have the bigger picture. But I can draw from some experience to put it in context. And so it's been fun doing the audio commentaries every week, and then every 2 weeks they're part of our newsletter. I also recommend that people go to livehealthybewell.com or wherever you get your podcasts and sign up for Live Healthy, Be Well, and then you'll get the weekly interview or lecture. But there's also through the week, occasionally we'll put up an audio, all the audio commentaries on the news go up there as well. So you can just listen to that as you're commuting.
Excellent. And at the top of the recording, we were talking about the different companies and the people that work in these companies. It's obvious that they must know what's going on.
Yeah.
And you have to ask yourself, why would they encourage this type of thing to go into the food chain, knowing it's going to make the population unwell?
Fits.
There's interesting, I was talking to a former Monsanto scientist who said that 3 of his colleagues at Monsanto tested the milk from cows treated with Monsanto's genetically engineered bovine growth hormone and found so much cancer-promoting hormone in the milk that the 3 scientists stopped drinking milk unless it was organic. One bought his own cow. The scientist also told me that they found that the rats were damaged from eating genetically engineered corn from Monsanto. And instead of withdrawing the corn, they rewrote the study to hide the effects. And he was concerned. He said, the amount of corn eaten in Southern Africa, it's a staple. It's eaten 3 times a day, the whole life. We know that Monsanto's corn research with rats, the maximum level of GMOs in the diet is 33% for 90 days. You can have 50% of your diet in South Africa or 70%. And in times of famine, 90%. So the scientist was very concerned, and we have now evidence that people eating large amounts of GMO corn. There's one story in my movie, Genetic Roulette, that's just devastating about people dying on a farm, 1 or 2 people a week among the staff of 60. They were eating 100% GMO corn every day. And the animals were suffering, and when they switched to non-GMO, they got better, both the animals and the humans. When they ran out of the non-GMO corn, they both started getting worse again. There's another person who used to work for Monsanto who I interviewed who tried to blow the whistle and said no one would pay attention. He was ostracized. We know that the mechanisms, and we know from the documents made public from the lawsuit and from the ways that they cover up their research, like they wanted to prove that Roundup wouldn't absorb into human skin. They applied it to cadaver skin, 10% absorbed, which is 3.3 times higher than what was allowed by the EPA. So they hid the evidence and took human cadaver skin, put it in an oven and baked it, put it in a freezer and froze it, took this leather-like, formerly human skin, applied Roundup to it and said, see, no absorption. So completely obvious. But what happens is there's a blinder set that is part of human training, and it's part of our educational system, it's part of medicine, it's part of science, where we have an epidemic that gives people the impression that it's not their responsibility, it's someone else's responsibility. And oftentimes there's a little asterisk, and I'm sure they're doing a good job. Like, it's the government's responsibility. So when I go to other countries and speak to their regulatory agencies, they may say, we do not have to evaluate GMOs because your FDA does. And I'm sure they're doing a good job. If you ask the FDA, their official policy is, we don't have to evaluate GMOs. We allow the companies to do it. And I'm sure they're doing a good job. When you look at the companies, you have this rigged research and denying evidence, and people within the companies who won't even participate in eating products from their own creations because they're aware of the dangers. So everyone thinks someone else is handling it. And so this is actually, in my work, this is the epidemic that I face as much as the epidemic of eating GMOs and glyphosate-laden foods. It's the epidemic of narrow thinking that it's not my responsibility. So that, like with the Protect Nature Now program, where we need to stop the replacement of nature, if everyone says it's not my responsibility, even if they're involved with all these other groups, well, it's not our area is global warming, our area is oceans. If that silo, narrow impact continues, then we lose. It's only by realizing we are the ones, it's not the government, we are the ones that need to take responsibility. What is my role? That's the first step. And that's not happening in corporations where there's a lot of pressure to not ask questions like that.
Yeah.
It is also the God complex. You know, they think science is a new God, and we can do better. We can improve on nature.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but in the face of the evidence that stops them drinking the milk that their products are treated with and that sort of thing, and obviously they're making a huge amount of money out of it, but there must be something more. Do you think there's something more insidious going on in the background here, Jeffrey?
People ask me that all the time. I've heard stories. Someone told me that they accidentally hacked in to a website in the 70s, that it was a CIA, Monsanto, and either State Department or someone else that was talking about creating termination seeds that they could drop into other countries to create famine, and then the US comes in to save the day and extract agreements. And apparently he did this accidental hacking, like 76, and that in high school, that's where you have computers in the 70s, and then got called to the principal's office a few days later, and there were men in suits from the CIA wanting to know what he read. And he had to sign papers that he wouldn't discuss it, and they didn't discuss it until he saw the whole program on Nova in an episode which has since disappeared. So when you talk about insidiousness, there was another person that was from the government talking to an activist, didn't know it was an activist, before GMOs was introduced, and said we need to get other countries to introduce GMOs so we can control their food supply. And we need to demonstrate acceptance in the United States so other countries accept it. Rockefeller, I think it was, Kissinger said, to control the people, you control the food.
Yeah.
So, and then Vandana Shiva, to control the food, you need to control the seed. So, profit and control are highly motivating. And there's political control, there's economic control, and the idea of Monsanto's master plan is revealed to their consultant, that the consultant talked about in the 1999 conference in January in San Francisco. They asked the Monsanto executives, describe your ideal future in 15 to 20 years. And the executives described a world in which 100% of all commercial seeds were genetically engineered and patented. And the consultant worked backwards from that goal to create the strategy and tactics to achieve it. And key to that success was the Monsanto control of the US government. So my friend who was there said it was the most arrogant statement he'd ever heard. But the idea is for a company that wants to control 100% of the seeds and willing to eliminate biodiversity in order to do that. And biodiversity is where we need to go when climate is changing, when there's possible famine. That biodiversity is the source of success, of security. So willing to risk the lives of literally billions of people by taking over the food supply and gambling on a technology which they know is prone to side effects. And now they're trying to do, to genetically engineer not just the seeds, but everything with DNA. We can't let them succeed.
No.
There's also a theory out there, and I know it sounds paranoid, but there's also a theory that the very powerful group out there is trying to limit the growth of population and or kill off some of us, culling of the masses.
Well, there is evidence that I've read about, sterilization through that has occurred at various countries where it's actually gone to court and proved that there was involuntary sterilization. So the desire to reduce the population growth is certainly on some people's agendas. As far as causing death and disease, a lot of people believe that to be the case. I haven't come up with the smoking gun on that, so I have no position on that. But certainly there's evidence that's already been verified of agendas to reduce population growth by various means.
Yeah.
Well, one of them would be to sterilize the going back to the comment you made earlier about the chiropractor that turn infertile women into fertile women again. If GMO are used to sterilize women, then the population growth then stops.
We do know that reproductive health is compromised with GMOs and Roundup, according to research. There was mice and rats that ate genetically engineered Roundup-ready soy, suffered from damaged young sperm cells, change in the structure of their uterus and ovaries, altered hormonal balance. It affects aromatase, which is changes the balance between estrogen and testosterone. The Roundup enters the cord blood, so it enters the unborn fetus. So does the Bt toxin, which is the insecticide, which we haven't spoken about. We have research out of Russia that showed that more than half of the babies or rat pups died when the mothers were fed GM soy, compared to 10% death rate when the mothers were fed non-GM soy. We have a 3-generation study, also someone from the Russian Academy of Sciences, this was unpublished, showing that by the 3rd generation, most of the hamsters in that study were infertile. There was also a 4 to 5-fold increase in infant mortality and a reduction in growth rate, and also birth defects. So there's evidence, and in the Roundup study where they injected Roundup into pregnant mice, the great-grandchildren, there was a high level of death among the mother mice when they were giving birth to the offspring, or among the offspring. So there was reproductive problems that were also part of the chemical exposure of Roundup. There's even more, I can go into it, but you get the point. I mean, whether by design or accident, I do believe that the infertility rate, the reduced sperm count, the reduced sperm motility is related to our agriculture methods, to GMOs, and to Roundup. Roundup Roundup grabs onto manganese, which is necessary for sperm motility. There's all sorts of, I mean, again, there's a lot of research that suggests that if someone wants to get pregnant, they should become organic eaters starting before conception. Not just once they're pregnant, but at least 2 weeks before conception, and ideally months before. Because within 2 weeks, you can clean out a large amount of the chemicals from the blood supply, but ideally long before 2 weeks. And then stay organic, because there are certain windows during pregnancy where if your body's exposed to certain types of chemicals, then there's certain particular types of birth defects that can occur. And Roundup is linked to birth defects. So is something called glyphosate, which is the Liberty pesticide herbicide that was originally created by Bayer. So being organic during that process, it also will help the gut bacteria, which is important, which is transferred from the mother to the child in the birth canal, and sets up a proper inoculation that can then create proper gut bacteria if the gut bacteria of the mother is healthy. So the gut bacteria can be unhealthy by eating non-organic stuff. So it's really important that if you know someone who's planning to get pregnant, have them watch the movie Secret Ingredients. Really important for the health of their child, for the life of their child.
True. Now we've covered a lot again today. You've just mentioned how people can start to change their health. What other positive moves can they make in order, one, to get away from GMO products, and also to limit as much as possible any effect that gene splice products might have on their health? Well,
eating organic is the primary. I have an online conference called Healing from GMOs and Roundup, which is available at healingfromgmos.com, where I interview 18 experts and ask them, in addition to changing your diet, what else can you do to detox, repair, and rebuild the system? So I have Dietrich Klinghardt, Lee Cowden, Joe Mercola, Josh Axe, Professor Seralini. I have a lot of very great, advanced practitioners and scientists, Kiran Krishnan, Zach Bush, and some of them have formulated products that they've tested with remarkable results. Some recommend procedures, some recommend a whole portfolio of supplements. Some focus on the fermented vegetables or the probiotics or prebiotics, or changing the diet so that you support the detox, the two-phase detoxification of the liver. But it's a very profoundly effective course where we had a bunch of community chats and people described it as the best online course they'd ever taken. And people that watched it twice or three times and then bought the whole series when it was free, a couple of years ago. They bought it because they wanted to study it and support us. And I find it to be a remarkable thing. Of course, we don't end up with a single protocol because I'm not capable of taking these geniuses and trying to whittle down what they say. I just expose people to the geniuses and let them decide which program they want to do.
Which is much like what we do with the Low Carb Paleo show.
Yes.
All of these products seem at some point to end up in the water supply.
Yeah.
And eventually, most water supplies end up in the sea. What does that say about the state of our fish?
Well, it's a good question. Glyphosate, when fed to carnivorous fish, damaged their digestive tract and caused suppression of the three types of enzymes that break down food. We know that glyphosate has in itself, it has some phosphate that can break up and end up in the water supply, which can cause algae blooming and dead zones. We know that it causes runoff into the water because it compacts the soil, it kills the beneficial bacteria, changes the structure of the soil, it gets the chemicals and the soil gets washed into the Mississippi, for example, gets brought into the Gulf of Mexico, and there's a huge dead zone with algae blooms. I was recently in Naples, and they had a red tide for over a year, where people were coughing because of, and also there was blue-green algae as well that has, you can't necessarily have the symptoms, so it's even more dangerous because you can have serious symptoms but not know because you're not coughing. So the whole ecosystem of the oceans is at risk from GMOs, Roundup, and chemical agriculture. It's not just GMO, it's not just Roundup, it's chemical agriculture. I haven't been spending the time evaluating the details of what happens in the ocean from the runoff. What I've told you is just probably a tip of the iceberg. I don't know what the glyphosate molecule does when it gets into the ocean and how it might change the ecosystem as it binds with minerals, making them unavailable. But there's so much of it.
Yeah.
You know, hundreds of millions of pounds of it in the ocean, in the air, in our food, in our land, that remediation will be necessary.
Yeah. I mean, you said earlier that Australia is one of those countries that's got open season on GMOs, gene splicing, et cetera, et cetera. Did I get that right?
Well, in Australia, I was referring to the gene editing. They passed,
right, okay.
They passed a policy which was upheld by their parliament that allowed gene-edited plants, animals, and microorganisms to be created and introduced without any government oversight.
What about GMOs? Is it fairly high on GMO acceptance?
There's a lot of pro-GMO power centers there. The government is pro-GMO. The states have the ability to prevent the planting. When I was brought over by activists who translated the book Genetic Roulette and gave one to every elected official in the country, I was unable to meet with the ministers of 2 different states because they had already aligned themselves with the biotech industry. 3 weeks after I left, they approved GMO canola. Whereas the other states, I was able to meet with the Minister of Agriculture and others, and they listened to what I said. I testified in the Tasmanian, in Hobart, and they were very open and they maintained the moratorium, whereas those that had been under the influence. Now, what we had predicted, where I was able to speak, and also through the media, had about 50 different media interviews, I predicted that if they introduced the canola, then they would be sacrificing the premium that they had over Canada, because Canadian canola was genetically engineered, and there was a $50 per ton premium in Australia as a result. It used to be that Canadian costs more, and then it was costing less. And I also said there'd be reduced market for it because people, groups like in Japan wouldn't be getting it, which was a major export destination. And what we predicted occurred. So when I had a plane a year later, or 2 years later, said, yeah, there's a big pile of harvested GMO canola in my area. No one wants it. It's been there for 2 years. And then there was also reduction. They couldn't sell the GM canola through their major export wings because they wouldn't touch it. There was a discount. Everything we said happened. There was contamination, destroying the ability of a farmer to sell his organic. Everything we predicted occurred. And yet there's still pro-GMO politicians and lobbyists ignoring what happened and saying we need GMOs to protect our farmers. So
so perhaps then the death of the coral reef and so forth might not just be down to alleged global warming. Perhaps it could be, runoff of things like
I have no
phosphate
evidence
into the sea. No, I wouldn't expect you to. It's just something that somebody should look at that.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, there's the acid rain, there's the global warming, there's other things, and I've heard some things about the global reef, coral reef. I tend to not just repeat what I've heard.
Yeah.
I'm like tunnel vision on GMOs and Roundup, and so if I hear something and someone says something about that, I'll investigate before I talk about that too. So unless it's first party, like I do talk about anecdotal evidence that I hear over and over again from the thousands and thousands of doctors who are prescribing non-GMO diets, and some scientists won't repeat that. And I'm like, as as David Perlmutter, Dr. David Perlmutter in our film says, the plural of anecdotal is data. So yeah, when I hear more testimonials from people and from practitioners and anyone in the world about these things, then I want to represent that to everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. So let's just sort of round off everything we've been talking about today by, if you can give people the 3 top things that they should do in order to avoid most of the problems with GMOs.
3. Well, I would say number 1 is eat organic. Number 2, you can go to rounduprisks.com to find out how you can eliminate or reduce the amount of Roundup sprayed in your area. If you have pets, go to petsandgmos.com for them. And I would say subscribe to responsibletechnology.org, because it's an evolving situation. And, if you watch this and go, oh my God, this is terrible, we need to do something, I'm eating organic, I want you to know if organic standards are under attack, if organic standards are considering gene editing, which there's some people in the USDA that wants them to do that. I want your signature on a petition. I want your phone call. If you're eating French fries somewhere and we find out that those French fries are from the innate potato, I want to let you know that when you go out to eat, I want you to know that those French fries are to be avoided because they may reprogram your DNA. So I want to be able to convey this information to people, and also would love your support.
Excellent.
I have a practical question. Is there a way to filter out glyphosate from tap water, or is there a filtering system that actually can filter the glyphosate?
We, those that subscribe to livehealthybewell.com, we also, and sometimes also at the Responsible Technology, we have people that have developed products and programs to help. And so I'll do a webinar, like I did a webinar with someone that had a rather expensive device that brought hydrogen into the water. So it has a lot of health benefits, but it also takes glyphosate out. I had to make sure he tested it for glyphosate before I was going to interview him. And we're looking at some lower cost versions that don't have the hydrogen that we'll be talking about as well. We're having webinars on those. So we'll keep people informed about what we come up with. Different saunas that people can use that are inexpensive, and we give discounts for those because we arrange it with the practitioner or with the developers. So livehealthybewell.com, and we'll get all that information to you.
Live healthy. Let me.
Be well.
Well,
I have another appointment right now.
Okay.
I have to jump. This has been delightful. I've enjoyed. We have gone on quite a journey.
Almost 2 hours.
Yeah.
Almost 2 hours. Well, thank you again. You're extremely knowledgeable, and if we didn't stop you once in a while, you never stop. So we have to shut down now. But thank you again for being on the Low Carb Paleo show. And as we say in Texas, à votre santé, y'all.
That's what they say in Texas.
All the time.
That's what we say all the time.
Thanks again, Jeffrey.